It was a truth universally acknowledged in the court of the Evernight that a mortal's heart was a fragile, fleeting thing. A bauble. A curiosity. Ilara had lived with this truth for 3 years, nestled in the cold, grand heart of King Caitian's domain, and had almost come to believe it herself. She was the court's exquisite paradox, the living girl in the land of the dead, her every warm breath a small rebellion against the eternal stillness. Caitian loved her for it. He loved the flush of blood in her cheeks after she ran up the great stone staircases, the way her hair would catch the rare moonlight that pierced the castle's high, Gothic windows, the frantic, living pulse at the base of her throat when he drew near. He called her his firefly, his summer storm, his brief, brilliant dawn. Tonight, the castle was quieter than usual, draped in the profound silence that fell after the moon reached its zenith. Ilara had been in the library, the scent of ancient paper and crumbling leather a familiar comfort. She'd found a book of star charts from a forgotten age, its pages filled with constellations that no longer graced the sky, and she wanted to show him. She pictured his smile, the rare, soft curving of his lips that was hers alone, the way his cool fingers would trace the faded ink as she explained the forgotten stories of the heavens. The thought propelled her through the winding, torchlit corridors, her soft-soled slippers making no sound on the polished obsidian floors. Caitian's study was at the heart of the royal wing, a sanctum of power where centuries of rule were stacked in scrolls and bound in leather. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm candlelight spilling into the hallway, painting a long, trembling rectangle on the stone. She heard voices from within, Caitian's, a low, resonant baritone that could command armies or soothe a nightmare, and another, drier and older, belonging to Valerus, his seneschal and confidant for half a millennium. Ilara smiled to herself, her hand poised to push the door open. She would wait a moment. She enjoyed the stolen pleasure of listening to him when he was unguarded, when he was not the king or the lover, but simply Caitian. The arrangement remains delicate, Valerus was saying, his voice thin as papyrus. The mortal's presence continues to unsettle the outer houses. They see it as a weakness, a distraction. A familiar chill, unrelated to the castle's ambient cold, traced its way down Ilara's spine. She had felt the weight of those ancient, resentful eyes on her at court. She was a disruption to their perfect, sterile order. Caitian's laugh was soft, dismissive. Let them see what they will. Their vision is clouded by dust and envy. They have forgotten what it is to feel anything but the thirst. And you have not. Valerus pressed, a rare note of challenge in his tone. My king, you have anchored your focus to a vessel of spun glass. It is beautiful, I grant you. But it is destined to break. What then? What of the centuries that will follow her? The grief. Grief is a luxury, Valerus. A human indulgence, Caitian cut in, his voice losing its warmth, taking on the sharp edge of command. I have survived the fall of empires and the shifting of continents. I will survive the passing of a girl. Ilara's hand fell from the door. Her breath caught in her throat. The words were a physical blow, striking the air from her lungs. She pressed her back against the cold corridor wall, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She was a girl. Just a girl. A passing. It is not her passing I fear for you, but the attachment itself, Valerus murmured, his voice softening as if sensing he had overstepped. You care for her. More than any other in living memory. There was a long silence. Ilara could picture the scene inside, Caitian standing by the great hearth, the firelight carving shadows across his ageless face, his expression unreadable. Valerus, a stooped figure cloaked in darkness, waiting. When Caitian finally spoke, his voice was contemplative, almost philosophical, and 1,000 times more cruel than his earlier dismissal. Her mortality is not a tragedy, old friend, he said, the sound carrying with perfect, devastating clarity into the hall. It is a mercy. Think of it. An eternity together, the slow erosion of novelty, the eventual, inevitable boredom. The weight of endless years would crush a love like ours. Her short life, it is a kindness, in a way. A convenient escape before eternity grows stale. A convenient escape. The words did not echo. They landed. They settled deep within her, a shard of ice in her soul. She felt the blood drain from her face, the warmth he so adored vanishing as if it had never been. The star charts in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Forgotten stories of dead stars. How fitting. He did not see her life. He did not see the precious, terrifying, beautiful brevity of it all. He saw a deadline. A closing chapter in one of his endless books. Her death was not a loss to be mourned, but a narrative device that would save him from the tedious epilogue. She was not his brilliant dawn, she was his scheduled sunset, a spectacle to be appreciated before the long, unchanging night resumed. Ilara did not make a sound. She stood frozen in the corridor, a ghost in her own life. The candlelight from the study flickered, and for a moment, she saw her own elongated shadow on the wall opposite. It was thin, insubstantial. A fleeting stain on the ancient stone. He had given her a name for what she was to him, a convenience. And he had given her a name for what her death would be, an escape. His escape. But the corridor was long, and there were two directions in which to walk. The escape, she realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that cut through the pain, did not have to be his. It could be hers. She turned away from the light spilling from his door and began to walk, her steps still silent, but now they were not the steps of a lover approaching, but of a prisoner finding an unlocked door. She was not escaping him. She was escaping his definition of her. She was taking her inconvenient, fragile, gloriously short life, and she was going to live it. She did not run. The impulse to flee, to sob, to shatter something, was a hot, wild thing inside her, but she contained it. A quiet, glacial calm settled over her, the kind of calm that follows a devastating storm. Her movements became deliberate, imbued with a purpose she hadn't felt since the day she'd first arrived, awestruck and terrified. She moved through the labyrinthine halls of the castle, but for the first time, she saw them not as a home, but as a map. She traced her path back to their chambers, the vast, opulent suite that had been their world. The air inside was still and scented with the night-blooming jasmine he kept in a crystal vase by the bed, its fragrance now cloying, suffocating. The moonlight streamed through the massive arched window, bathing the room in a spectral silver. It was a room designed for an immortal's sensibilities, dark woods, heavy velvets, silver and obsidian. Her own few possessions seemed like wildflowers sprouting from a glacier. A stack of novels with cracked spines on the nightstand. A shawl knitted from rough, colorful wool draped over a chaise lounge. A small, clumsy watercolor she had painted of the sunrise, propped against a silver mirror. Her eyes fell upon her reflection in that mirror. The face that looked back was pale, her eyes wide and dark with shock. But it was her face. It was alive. There was a faint crease of worry between her brows that hadn't been there a year ago. The corners of her mouth were softer from smiling. These were the marks of her life, the tiny etchings of time that he found so charming and, ultimately, so disposable. He saw her as a flower, beautiful in its bloom and destined to wither. He could appreciate the withering as part of the beauty. But she was not a flower in his garden. She was the gardener. A convenient escape, she whispered to her reflection. The words tasted like poison. He had spoken them as a logical observation, the cold calculus of an eternal being. He would never understand that he had taken her life, her one and only life, and reframed it as a service to him. Her death would be his relief. The thought was a second, deeper wound. It wasn't just that he wouldn't miss her forever, it was that he was grateful he wouldn't have to. The grief was a vast, hollow space inside her chest. It was for the love she had believed in, a love she had thought was a bridge between their two alien worlds. Now she saw it was a cage, gilded and comfortable, but a cage nonetheless. The bars were his perception of her. She moved to the large, carved wardrobe that housed her clothes. Most were silks and velvets in deep jewel tones, gifts from him. They were costumes for the part she played, the mortal queen. She pushed them aside, her fingers searching for the simple, practical clothes she had arrived in. A worn linen shirt. Sturdy wool trousers. Leather boots that were scuffed at the toes. They felt real in her hands, solid. They felt like herself. She would not take his jewels. She would not take his silks. She would not take anything that belonged to his world. She began to gather her few, true possessions. The worn book of poetry her father had given her. A small, smooth river stone she'd carried in her pocket since childhood. The colorful, scratchy shawl. Each object was a piece of her own story, a story that had begun long before Cation and would now, she vowed, continue long after him. She folded the shawl and placed it in a simple leather satchel. She looked at the watercolor of the sunrise. It depicted a burst of pink and orange over a line of hills she remembered from her village. It was a clumsy painting, But it was hers. It was a testament to a morning she had witnessed, a moment of beauty she had tried to capture. A moment in a finite series of moments. She hesitated, then left it where it was, propped against the silver mirror. A final, silent message. Let him look at her version of the dawn and remember what he had so carelessly dismissed. Her hands trembled as she worked, not from fear, but from a profound and terrible resolve. Every silent, purposeful action was a severing. She was untangling herself from him, from the life that had been offered to her. It had been a beautiful dream, but she was awake now. The price of the dream was to have the end of her life celebrated as a release. It was a price she would not pay. She dressed in her old clothes. They felt like an embrace. She laced her boots, the familiar gesture grounding her. When she was done, she stood in the center of the room, the small satchel clutched in her hand. The moon had moved across the sky, and the light had shifted. The room was the same, but she was a stranger in it. She took one last look around. At the bed where they had shared stories and secrets. At the vase of jasmine, it sent now a memory of a love that was a lie. Her heart ached with a grief so sharp it was difficult to breathe. But beneath the grief, a new feeling was taking root, a fierce, protective love for the years that stretched before her. 10 years. 20. Maybe 50, if she was lucky. They were a pittance to him, a blink of an eye. To her, they were everything. They were an entire world. And he would not have them. He would not have the convenience of her end. She would take her years, her seasons, her sunrises, and her eventual, inevitable, meaningful death, and she would walk away with them. They were the only treasure she had, and she was stealing them back. Cation lingered in his study long after Valerus had bowed his way out into the silent corridors. The old vampire's words had left a faint, unpleasant residue in the air, a whisper of anxieties Cation had long trained himself to ignore. Attachments were complications. Emotions were variables in an equation that spanned millennia. He had learned long ago to hold things lightly, to appreciate beauty without seeking to possess it for all time. It was the only way to survive eternity without going mad. He looked into the fire, the flames dancing in his dark eyes. He thought of Ilara. He saw her as she'd been that afternoon, her face alight with laughter as she tried, and failed, to teach a fledgling raven to speak her name. The warmth of that image spread through him, a familiar, pleasant sensation. She was so full of life, a stark, vibrant contrast to the stasis of his court. She was a breath of fresh air in a sealed tomb. His words to Valerus had been a clinical assessment, a strategic truth. He loved Ilara, in his way. The way an ancient, unmoving mountain might love the fleeting passage of a summer cloud. He cherished her presence, the light she brought into his long night. But he was a realist. He knew she would fade. Her bright flame would burn out. And he, the mountain, would remain. To pretend otherwise, to allow himself to believe in a forever that was not possible, would be a form of self-destruction. He had seen younger, more sentimental immortals shatter themselves against the rocks of mortal love. He was wiser. His affection for her was genuine, but his perspective was eternal. The eventual parting was a certainty, and in its certainty, there was a strange, cold comfort. A neat ending. No messy, lingering goodbyes that stretched into decades of decay. A clean break. A convenient escape from a protracted, painful decline. He felt a pang of something. Not guilt. Not regret. A faint disquiet. Perhaps the words had been too cold, even for Valerus. But they were true. Truth was often cold. He had expected her to come to him by now. She often did, drifting into his study like a moonbeam, her presence a silent, welcome interruption. He missed the weight of her head on his shoulder as she read over his correspondence, her soft human scent mixing with the ancient smells of his world. He pushed himself away from the hearth, the decision made. Work was done for the night. He would go to her. He moved through the castle with the silent grace of a predator, his senses attuned to the world in ways no human could comprehend. He could hear the slow, syrupy beat of a sleeping guard's heart 3 floors below, smell the dust motes dancing in a distant corridor. But he could not sense her. Her particular, vibrant life force, usually a beacon to him within the castle walls, was muted. Distant. He frowned. Perhaps she was sleeping more deeply than usual. When he entered their chambers, the silence was different. It was not the peaceful silence of slumber. It was the hollow silence of absence. The room was cold, the moonlight painting sterile silver bars across the floor. The scent of jasmine was thick, but underneath it, something was missing. Her scent. The warm, living aroma of her skin, her hair. His eyes scanned the room, cataloguing the details with an unnatural precision. The bed was untouched, the velvet coverlet smooth and perfect. The stack of her novels on the nightstand seemed smaller. He moved closer. A book was missing, the one filled with sea shanties she'd been reading to him, her voice full of laughter at the bawdy lyrics. A small, insignificant detail. Then he saw the chaise lounge. The colourful shawl she was always wrapped in, the one she'd brought with her from her old life, was gone. Another small thing. But the small things were beginning to accumulate. His gaze fell upon the silver mirror. Propped against it was her little painting of the sunrise. He had always found it charmingly amateurish, a splash of garish, hopeful colour in his monochrome world. Now, its presence felt deliberate. Accusatory. A sunrise she had left behind. A cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach, a sensation so alien he barely recognized it. This was not the disquiet of a few moments ago. This was the precursor to dread. He was immortal. He was a king. He did not feel dread. He strode to the wardrobe and pulled the heavy doors open. Her gowns of silk and velvet hung like the shed skins of some beautiful, absent creature. But his eyes, sharp enough to see a spider spin its web in the dark, noticed the gap. The space where her simple, human clothes had hung. He stood motionless for a full minute, his mind processing the information with the speed of a striking viper. The missing book. The missing shawl. The missing clothes. The painting left behind. The absolute, profound absence of her life force in this room, in this castle. This was not an errand. This was not a late-night walk in the castle gardens. This was a departure. But why? There had been no fight. No argument. Yesterday, she had been laughing in the aviary. This afternoon, she had kissed him, her lips warm and full of life, before he had closeted himself with Valerus. The sequence made no sense. His mind, accustomed to patterns and logic that spanned centuries, could find no pattern here. Mortals were impulsive, yes, but this was silent. This was surgical. He thought back, retracing his steps, his day. The meeting with the envoys from the south. The review of the trade ledgers. The conversation with Valerus. He replayed the words in his mind, dissecting them. The mortal's presence, a weakness, a vessel of spun glass. Standard courtly concerns. He had dismissed them, defended her. He had. His thoughts snagged. He froze, the memory of his own voice filling the silent chamber. Her short life, it is a kindness, in a way. A convenient escape before eternity grows stale. The words hung in the air, shimmering like heat haze. Spoken in the abstract safety of his study, they had been a logical theorem, a philosophical point. Here, in the empty room that screamed of her absence, they sounded different. They sounded like a condemnation. Like an epitaph. An epitaph for a love he had just realized was not a fleeting diversion, but the very center of his world. The door to his study had been ajar. The cold knot in his stomach tightened into a sphere of ice. He could suddenly picture it with sickening clarity. Elara, her face alight with the intention of sharing some small joy, pausing in the corridor. The sound of his voice, carrying on the still night air. Her, hearing those words. Hearing her entire existence, her love, her life, her death, reduced to a convenience. For him. The arrogance of it. The breathtaking, colossal arrogance. He had been speaking of eternity, but she lived in moments. He had been speaking of strategy, but she lived in feelings. He had analyzed her life as a variable in his own, and in doing so, he had utterly and completely erased her. A sound escaped his throat, a harsh, guttural noise he had not made in centuries. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. The carefully constructed logic, the wisdom of ages, the detachment that had kept him safe, it all fractured. He was not a mountain. He was a fool. A blind, arrogant fool who had held a star in his hands and complained that it would one day burn out. He had not just lost her. He had driven her away. He had handed her the reason, sharpened the blade, and pointed her toward the door. And she, with the quiet strength he had mistaken for fragility, had simply walked through it. The escape, he finally understood, had not been his to wait for. It had been hers to claim. Ilara's first breath of free air was a shock to her system. It was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth, pine needles, and the distant promise of rain, a chaotic perfume of decay and life that the castle's sterile air never allowed. She had slipped out through a small postern gate in the northern wall, a passage used by gardeners and scullions, a route she knew from her early, exploratory days in the castle. The knowledge, once a charming secret between her and the ancient fortress, had become her key. She did not look back. To look back would be to risk seeing it, the colossal silhouette of the castle against the moonlit sky, a jagged crown of towers piercing the heavens. It was a place of breathtaking, terrible beauty, a place that had been her home and her prison. Looking back would invite the grief that was nipping at her heels, a cold, hungry wolf. She could not afford to feel it yet. Not now. Now, there was only the path forward, a muddy track leading into the deep, dark woods that bordered Caitian's domain. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of roots and slick, damp leaves. The sounds were a symphony of mortal life, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, the mournful hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind through the high branches. In the castle, the only sounds had been stone, silence, and the faint, rhythmic beat of dormant hearts. Here, everything was alive and vocal. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. Her fear was a constant, low hum beneath her skin. It was not a fear of the dark, or of the woods. It was the fear of being found. She imagined his wraith-like scouts flitting through the trees, their red eyes glowing in the dark. She imagined Caitian himself, appearing before her like a column of shadow and fury, his voice the sound of grinding stone as he demanded to know why she had fled. What would she say? "You called my life a convenience." How could she explain the depth of that wound to a being who measured time in epochs? How could she make him understand that her 60 or 70 years were not a brief prelude to his eternity, but the entire, complete story for her? She couldn't. The chasm between them was not one of affection, but of comprehension. And it was unbridgeable. This knowledge settled the fear, hardening it into resolve. She was not just running from him, she was running towards a world that understood her own scale. For 3 days, she walked, following the sun's path westward, sleeping in hollows and foraging for berries she recognized from her childhood. The hunger was a sharp, clean ache. The fatigue was a heavy blanket that pulled at her limbs. These sensations were grounding. They were the language of her body, a language the immortals had forgotten. Every sore muscle, every pang of hunger, was a reminder that she was alive and fighting for that life. On the 4th day, she stumbled out of the forest and onto a dirt road that led to a small, unassuming village. The sight of smoking chimneys and the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer brought tears to her eyes. It was the beautiful, mundane music of humanity. She had a few coins, enough for a room at the local inn and a simple meal. The innkeeper, a stout woman with flour on her apron, looked at her worn clothes and muddy boots with suspicion, but her exhaustion must have been plain on her face. She was given a small, plain room under the eaves. The bed was lumpy, the blanket coarse, but as she sank into it, a wave of profound relief washed over her. She was anonymous. She was just a traveler. She was no one's firefly, no one's summer storm. She was just Ilara. She found work at the village tannery. It was hard, smelly, unglamorous work, scraping hides and treating leather. Her hands, once soft and pale from a life of leisure, became chapped and calloused. The smell clung to her clothes and hair. But at the end of each day, she was paid a few coppers, and with those coppers, she could buy bread, cheese, and a candle for her small room. There was an elegant, brutal simplicity to it, work for life. The first few weeks were a blur of grief. At night, in the quiet of her room, the wolf she had outrun would catch up. She would lie awake and ache for him. She missed the weight of his hand in hers, the low murmur of his voice reading ancient poetry, the feeling of utter safety she had felt in his powerful embrace. She mourned the man she thought he was, the love she thought they shared. The tears would come then, hot and silent. But they were tears for a ghost. The man who had spoken those words in the study was a stranger to her, a king she did not know. As autumn bled into a harsh, biting winter, a slow change began. The sharp edges of her grief started to soften. The ache became a dull, persistent throb rather than a piercing wound. She began to notice the world around her again. She noticed the way the frost painted intricate ferns on her windowpane. She learned the names of the other workers at the tannery, gruff, kind-hearted people who shared their meager lunches with her and told her stories of their children. She discovered the deep, satisfying warmth of a hearth after a day spent in the cold, the simple joy of a hot bowl of stew. These were the things that had no place in Caitian's world. His world had grandeur, but it had no warmth. It had beauty, but no change. It had eternity, but no moments. Her life was now a string of moments. The satisfaction of a well-scraped hide. The shared laughter over a coarse joke. The quiet beauty of the snow falling outside her window, blanketing the world in white. She was living. Not as an ornament, not as a concept, but as a person. The phrase that had driven her away, a convenient escape, began to transform in her mind. It was no longer just an insult. It became a mission statement. Her life was not an escape for him. It was an escape for her. An escape from a love that was conditional, from a world that saw her as a ticking clock. She was escaping into the messy, difficult, beautiful, and finite business of being human. One evening, as she walked home from the tannery, the sky was a riot of bruised purple and fiery orange. A winter sunset. She stopped in the middle of the muddy street, heedless of the cold, and just watched it. She watched the colors deepen, then fade into the deep indigo of twilight. It lasted only a few minutes. It was breathtaking. And it would never happen in exactly the same way again. A smile touched her lips, a real, unforced smile. It felt unfamiliar. He could have 1,000 years of unchanging moonlight. She would take this. She would take every fleeting sunset, every budding leaf in spring, every wrinkle that would one day line her face. She would take her handful of years, and she would live them until they were full. The first week of Ilara's absence was a study in controlled chaos for Caitian. He dispatched his most trusted scouts, not with threats and displays of power, but with quiet, insidious instructions, to listen, to watch, to search for a whisper of a woman with sunrise in her hair and defiance in her heart. He forbade them from touching her, from even speaking to her. They were to be his eyes, nothing more. He needed to know where she was, that she was safe. The rest he had not yet figured out. The castle became a hollow, echoing shell. Her absence was a physical entity, a cold draft that snaked through every room. He would walk into their chambers and the scent of jasmine would mock him. He would pass the library and expect to see her curled in a chair, lost in a book. Every corner held her ghost. His immortality, once a source of unshakable confidence, now felt like a curse. It was a vast, empty expanse of time that he would have to endure without her. He had survived the fall of empires, yes, but that was different. Empires were stone and dust. Ilara was warmth and light. His court sensed the shift in him. The air grew tense. His temper, usually held in perfect, icy check, became volatile. A careless courtier who spilled wine was banished for a decade. A minstrel whose song was too melancholy was dismissed with a snarl. He was a storm cloud gathering force. It was Valerus who finally dared to approach him. He found Caitian in the throne room, not on the throne, but standing before the great, dark slab of obsidian, staring at his own faint reflection. "My king," Valerus said, his voice a dry rustle in the cavernous room. "The scouts return with nothing. It is as if she has vanished from the earth." Caitian did not turn. "She has not vanished," he said, his voice low and tight. "She has hidden. She is clever. She learned this castle's secrets. She is using them against me. Perhaps she does not wish to be found." The words were simple, yet they struck Caitian with the force of a physical blow. He slowly turned to face his seneschal. His eyes, usually dark and unreadable, were filled with a raw, ancient pain that startled Valerus. "She has every right not to wish it," Caitian said, the admission costing him dearly. He paced the length of the dais, his movements agitated, panther-like. "You were right, old friend. I was attached. I am attached. The vessel of spun glass has broken, and I find the shards are sharper than I anticipated." Valerus remained silent, allowing his king the space for this unprecedented vulnerability. "I cannot find the flaw in my logic, Valerus," Caitian continued, his voice laced with genuine, desperate confusion. "Eternity is a burden. Love fades. Is that not a truth we have both witnessed 100 times over?" "It is a vampire's truth, my king," Valerus said softly. "You spoke a truth of your world and expected it to hold true in hers. You spoke of the tedium of 1,000 years to a woman who measures her life in seasons. You did not lie, but you did not speak her truth. And you did it, in her hearing. Cation stopped pacing. He looked at Valerus, truly looked at him, for the first time in weeks. The seneschal's face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each one earned over centuries of quiet observation. I need to find her, Cation said, the desperation raw. I need to make her understand. Understand what, sire? That your eternal perspective makes her fleeting existence a footnote? That you regret the sentiment or only that she overheard it? The question was brutal, and for a moment, Cation's fury flared. But it died as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold, hollowing shame. He didn't have an answer. In the first few days, he had wanted to find her to reclaim her, to restore the order of his world. Now he wasn't sure. The memory of his own words haunted him. A convenient escape. He finally heard them. Not as a king, not as an immortal, but as the man who loved the woman who was gone. He heard the casual cruelty, the profound dismissal of everything she was. He had praised her for her warmth, her vibrancy, her life, and in one breath, revealed that he saw that very life as an eventual inconvenience to be tided away. He sank onto the steps of his throne, a gesture of defeat no one had seen from him in centuries. He buried his face in his hands, the cold stone of his rings pressing into his skin. What have I done? The question was not directed at Valerus. It was a whisper to the empty room, to the ghost of the woman who had filled it with light. You have learned a lesson that costs most of our kind their sanity, my king, Valerus said, his voice gentle. You have learned that a mortal heart is not a bauble. It is a universe, with its own time, its own laws, its own beginning and end. And you, in all your power, are merely a visitor there. Cation looked up, his expression stripped bare of all artifice. The king was gone. Only the grieving man remained. How do I fix it, Valerus? The old vampire gave a slow, sad shake of his head. I do not know if you can. You cannot unsay the words. You cannot unwound the heart. All you can do is understand why they were wounding. You have been searching for her body. I suggest you begin searching for her perspective. Valerus's words became Cation's new obsession. Search for her perspective. He called off the scouts. Their methods were too crude, their senses too attuned to the hunt. They were searching for a warm body, a beating heart. But Ilara was more than that. She was a way of seeing the world. To find her, he had to learn to see as she did. He began to walk his own lands. Not as a king on patrol, but as a solitary wanderer. For the first time in centuries, he paid attention to the details of the mortal world he ruled but had never truly inhabited. He left the castle at dusk and walked until dawn. He watched the lamplighters in the villages, the fishermen casting their nets in the cold morning mist, the bakers firing their ovens. He saw the texture of their lives, the rhythm of work and rest, of seasons and celebrations. He began to understand the value they placed on time. A good harvest was not an abstract economic gain, it was the food that would see their families through the winter. A wedding was not a strategic alliance, it was the hopeful beginning of a new, short line of descendants. A funeral was not the closing of a file, it was a raw, gaping wound in the fabric of a community. He sat on a hill one evening, overlooking a small town, and watched the lights come on in the windows, one by one. Each light was a home, a family, a small, fleeting world of joys and sorrows. He had always seen his domain as a collection of resources, of souls to be managed. Now, for the first time, he saw it as a tapestry of individual lives. Each thread was short, fragile, and utterly unique. And the tapestry was beautiful because the threads were short. Their brevity gave them their color, their meaning. An endless, uniform thread would create nothing but a gray, featureless cloth. A profound, aching loneliness settled over him. He was the endless thread. He had mistaken his curse for a strength. Ilara had not been a brief splash of color in his gray existence. She had been a master weaver, trying to show him the beauty of the whole design, and he had been too arrogant to see it. His search was no longer for her. It was for the understanding he had lacked. He needed to learn the language of her world, not so he could command her to return, but so he could, if he ever saw her again, finally apologize. Not for being overheard, but for the very thought itself. He needed to tell her that he had been wrong. That her life was not a convenience. It was a miracle. And he had been blind to it. The realization was his true penance, a heavier weight than any century he had ever endured. The search led him to a small, unremarkable town nestled by a river, smelling of wet leather and wood smoke. It was winter, and the air was sharp with cold. There was nothing to distinguish this town from 100 others he had passed through, yet something held him there. A feeling. A faint, familiar resonance in the air, like a song half remembered. It was the ghost of her presence, a trace of her unique vitality left on the wind. He walked the streets as a mortal would, bundled in a heavy cloak, his head bowed. He was an anomaly, his stillness and grace out of place among the bustling, work-worn villagers, but his power was a shroud, turning their eyes away from him. He passed a bakery, the smell of fresh bread a warm, alien cloud. He passed a smithy, the ring of the hammer a vibrant, living pulse. He passed a tannery, the acrid, chemical smell sharp in his sensitive nostrils. It was a place of work, of transformation. Of life and death in a raw, elemental form. Then he saw it. A small building with dusty windows and a modest sign, village library and scriptorium. His dead heart gave a lurch. A library. Her sanctuary. He felt the pull grow stronger, an invisible thread tugging him forward. He stood across the narrow street, half hidden in the deep shadows of an alley, and simply watched. Inside, Ilara pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, her fingers leaving a faint smudge of ink on her temple. The library was her haven. After months at the tannery, her knowledge of letters and histories, a gift from her life with Cation, had earned her a position assisting the town's elderly librarian. The work was quiet, meticulous. She spent her days mending books, copying documents, and sometimes, reading to the village children. The grief for Cation had settled into a soft, permanent ache, a scar on her heart that she had learned to live with. She had a life here. It was small, simple, and entirely her own. She had friends. She had purpose. She was content. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between pages, she would see his face, his dark, intense eyes, and the scar would pull tight. A flicker of movement outside the window caught her eye. A tall figure, cloaked and hooded, standing in the alley across the street. There was a stillness about him that was unnerving, a predatory grace that did not belong in this clumsy, mortal world. Her breath caught. The shape was familiar. The posture was a memory seared into her soul. Cation. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She instinctively shrank back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He had found her. After all this time, he had found her. The fragile piece she had built for herself shattered into 1,000 pieces. She imagined him striding across the street, the door bursting open, his voice commanding her to return. She imagined the terror in the eyes of the villagers, the simple people who had been kind to her, as they faced the reality of what he was. She pressed herself against a tall shelf of books, the leather spines cool against her back. She closed her eyes, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Don't see me. Please, don't see me. Across the street, Cation's senses were on fire. The pull was intoxicating, undeniable. She was here. In this building. He could smell the faint, beloved scent of her skin mixed with the smells of old paper and ink. He could almost hear the frantic, terrified beat of her heart. The sound was a torment. He was the cause of that fear. His presence here, his very existence, was a threat to the peace she had found. He took a half step out of the alley, the instinct to go to her, to tear down the walls between them, nearly overwhelming him. He wanted to see her face, to drink in the sight of her. He wanted to fall to his knees and beg her forgiveness. But he stopped. He saw his own reflection in the dusty glass of the library window, a dark, menacing shape. He saw what she would see. Not the penitent lover, but the monster. The king. The jailer. To approach her now would be an act of violence. It would be for his own selfish need for absolution, not for her peace. He had come searching for her perspective, and in this moment, he found it. Her perspective was a wall of books, a pane of glass, and a street between them. It was the desperate, silent plea of her racing heart, leave me be. The realization was the cruelest blow yet. To truly love her, to truly atone for his arrogance, he had to do the one thing his every instinct screamed against. He had to walk away. He had to leave her to the life she had chosen, the life he had almost cost her. His love for her could not be a cage. It had to be a release. With an effort of will that felt like tearing his own soul in two, he pulled back into the shadows. He looked at the library one last time, a humble wooden building holding the entire world. He saw the faint, warm glow of the lamp on her desk. She was in there, living, breathing, safe from him. It had to be enough. He turned and melted back into the deepening twilight. The invisible thread that connected them stretched, thinned, but did not break. It was now a cord of pure, selfless agony. Elara waited, her body trembling, for what felt like an eternity. The door did not burst open. No shadow fell across the threshold. Slowly, cautiously, she crept back to the window. The alley across the street was empty. The figure was gone. She scanned the street, her eyes wide, searching every shadow. Nothing. It was as if he had never been there. Had she imagined it? A waking nightmare born of her deepest fear? No. The feeling had been too real. The terror too absolute. He had been there. And he had left. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass, her legs weak with relief and a profound, aching confusion. Why? Why would he come all this way only to leave? She didn't understand. But as she stood there, watching the snow begin to fall in thick, silent flakes, a new feeling began to bloom in the space the panic had left behind. Not peace, not yet. But a flicker of something like it. A question. A possibility. A hope so fragile she barely dared to give it a name. He had found her. And he had let her go. The journey back to his castle was a pilgrimage through a changed world. Caitian saw everything through new eyes, the eyes of a man who had glimpsed a truth he could never see. The mortal world was no longer a dull, grey backdrop to his eternal drama, it was the entire play, and he was but a spectator in the wings. His encounter in the snowy village had not brought him closure, but clarity. A terrible, piercing clarity. He had seen her, and he had seen her fear of him. That fear was his doing, the direct result of his power, his nature, and the careless words that had laid his soul bare. He could not take back the words, but he could change the man who had spoken them. When he returned to the court of the Evernight, he was not the same king who had left. The volatile, grieving tyrant was gone, replaced by a being of immense, sorrowful stillness. His court, accustomed to the familiar cadence of his power, felt the shift immediately. The air, once thick with tension and fear, became heavy with a profound, contemplative silence. His first act was to throw open the great shutters in the throne room. For the first time in centuries, dusty shafts of afternoon sun, weak, wintry, but sun nonetheless, pierced the gloom, illuminating the swirling motes of dust that had danced in darkness for ages. The ancient vampires of his inner circle hissed and shrank back, shielding their sensitive eyes. "We have lived in the dark for too long," Caitian said, his voice quiet but resonant with an unshakable finality. "We have forgotten that there is a world that operates by a different clock. We have become stale." He used the word deliberately. Stale. The echo of his own fatal pronouncement to Valerus. It was a judgment on himself, on them all. He began to dismantle the rigid, suffocating traditions of his court. He decreed that the mortal servants would no longer be treated as invisible furniture, their lives held in contempt. He established schools for them, offered them wages, and punished any of his kind who harmed them. He began to engage with the mortal lords of the neighboring lands not as a predator tolerating his prey, but as a peer. He opened trade routes, shared agricultural knowledge gleaned from centuries of observation, and listened to their concerns. He was rewriting the terms of his existence, and by extension, the existence of his entire kingdom. He was trying to build a world where Elara, or someone like her, would not have to flee in terror. A world where the bridge between their two realities was not a fragile thread of affection, but a solid structure of mutual respect. Valerus watched the transformation with a quiet, knowing awe. "You are letting the sun in, my king," he murmured one evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking a newly planted garden, its plots laid out for flowers that would bloom in the spring. "She was the sun," Caitian replied, his gaze distant. "I was merely a cave that was lucky enough to face the dawn. I did not understand the light until it was gone." His personal penance was more private. He spent his nights not in governance, but in study. He moved his desk into the library, Elara's former sanctuary. He read the books she had loved, tales of adventure, poetry that sang of love and loss, histories of ordinary people. He was trying to learn her language, the language of the human heart. He read of joy and grief, of hope and despair, of the 1,000 tiny moments that constitute a life. He began to understand. Her life was not a straight line to be measured, but a tapestry to be experienced. Its beauty was in its complexity, its flaws, its vibrant, chaotic colors. Her death, when it came, would not be an ending that brought him relief, but the final, crucial thread that completed the masterpiece. To wish it away, or to fail to mourn it, would be to dishonor the entire work. One night, sitting at the desk where she had so often worked, he found a small, forgotten piece of charcoal. He picked it up, the dusty texture foreign against his cold skin. He pulled a fresh sheet of parchment towards him. He had to tell her. Even if she never saw it, he had to give the words form. He had to complete the act of his own transformation. He began to write. It was not a king's decree or a lover's plea. It was a confession. Elara, he wrote, the name itself a painful, beautiful ache in his chest. I do not write to ask for your return. I write to ask for your forgiveness, though I know I have not earned it. I have spent these last months walking in the world you chose over mine, and I have begun, only just begun, to see what you have always seen. I saw your life as a brief, beautiful flame, and I pitied it for its brevity. I was a fool. A flame is not measured by how long it burns, but by the light it casts and the warmth it gives. Your light was blinding, and your warmth was the only real thing in my long, cold life. His hand trembled, a human gesture he had not experienced in 1,000 years. When I spoke of your mortality as a convenient escape, I spoke with the arrogance of a being who has mistaken survival for living. I saw your life only in relation to my own, as a chapter in my endless story. I failed to see that your life was its own story, complete and perfect in its own right, and I was but a character in it. The most profound honor of my existence was to have been allowed on its pages at all. The escape was mine, Elara. An escape from feeling, from change, from the terror and beauty of a life that has an end. You did not run from me. You ran towards life. And I, finally, understand. I see the value in the seasons, in the sunrise, in the lines that time will draw on a beloved face. I see that a life is not precious in spite of its end, but because of it. I will not seek you again. My love for you, if I am to honor it at all, must now manifest as my distance. It must be the cage door I leave open, not the hand that pulls you back inside. I hope you find joy. I hope you find love. I hope you live a life so full of moments that it spills over the brim. Know only this, there is a king in a cold, stone castle who is, for the first time, learning what it means to live, all because of a girl who was brave enough to show him what he was missing. He is letting the sun in. He is planting a garden. He is trying to become a man worthy of the memory of your light. He signed it simply, Cation. He folded the parchment, his movements slow and deliberate. He would not send it. It was an act of contrition for himself alone. He sealed it with plain wax, leaving it unmarked, and locked it away in a small, iron box. It was his heart, memorialized on paper. He had finally articulated his understanding. And in doing so, he had, at last, truly let her go. He would rule his changed kingdom. He would carry her memory. It was a lonely penance, but it was a living one. And for that, he had her to thank. 15 years. It was a lifetime. Long enough for calluses to soften, for grief to become a familiar companion rather than a ravenous beast, for a new life to put down roots so deep they felt as if they had always been there. Elara was no longer the girl who had fled a vampire's castle. She was a woman. There were threads of silver in her dark hair now, fine as spun moonlight, and a delicate web of lines around her eyes from 15 years of laughter, and sorrow, and squinting at the sun. She had left the tannery and the small village behind years ago. She was now the respected proprietor of a bookshop in a bustling, coastal city, a place that smelled of salt and ink and possibility. She had not married. There had been suitors, kind and decent men, but her heart remained a quiet, guarded country. The scar Cation had left was no longer painful, but it was a part of her landscape. She had built a life of quiet joys, the satisfaction of placing the perfect book into a customer's hands, the warmth of her cat sleeping on her lap, the friendship of the merchants and artisans on her street, the breathtaking view of the sea from her apartment window. Her life was full. It was hers. She thought of him, sometimes. Not with the sharp ache of her youth, but with a distant, melancholic fondness, the way one might remember a powerful, transformative dream. She hoped he was well, in his cold, eternal way. She hoped he had found a peace that did not require the dismissal of others. She had forgiven him long ago, not for his sake, but for hers. Forgiveness was the only way to truly be free. One crisp autumn morning, a courier delivered a small, unassuming wooden box to her shop. It bore no seal, no sender's mark. Her heart gave a curious, hesitant flutter. The wood was dark, ancient, and cool to the touch. It felt familiar. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded black velvet, was a single, perfectly preserved flower. A night-blooming jasmine, its white petals still pristine, its fragrance, faint but unmistakable, rising to meet her. It was the first flower he had ever given her, a cutting from the ageless vines that clung to the castle's western tower. He had told her it bloomed only in the deepest dark, for the moon alone. Beneath the flower was a single sheet of folded parchment, yellowed with age, sealed with a simple drop of blank wax. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, who it was from. Her breath hitched. This was not the act of a monster or a jailer. A monster would have sent an army. A jailer would have sent a cage. This was something else entirely. She took the letter to her apartment above the shop, her hands unsteady. She sat by the window overlooking the sea, the afternoon sun warming her face, and broke the seal. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and achingly familiar. She read. She read of a king who had learned to see the world through her eyes. She read of a man who had mistaken survival for living, and who had finally understood the difference. She read of a love that had transformed into respect, a desire for possession that had become a selfless wish for her happiness. A flame is not measured by how long it burns, but by the light it casts and the warmth it gives. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the elegant script. They were not tears of sorrow or of renewed grief. They were tears of a profound, cleansing release. These were the words she had needed to hear 15 years ago. These were the words she had never thought she would hear. It was not a plea. It was not an excuse. It was an apology. A perfect, complete, and soul-deep apology. He had seen her. After all this time, across all that distance, he had finally, truly seen her. I hope you live a life so full of moments that it spills over the brim. She looked up from the letter, out at the vast, glittering sea. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of gold and rose. Another fleeting, perfect sunset. A moment. Her moment. She had taken her years, the years he would never have, and she had filled them. She had filled them with work and friendship, with books and the sea, with quiet joys and silent sorrows. She had built a life not in opposition to him, but in celebration of the very thing he had once dismissed, its precious, finite, and beautiful nature. And he, in his eternal twilight, had learned the same lesson. He was letting the sun in. He was planting a garden. He was becoming a man worthy of a memory. A slow smile touched Ilara's lips. It was a smile of peace, of closure. The bridge between their worlds had not collapsed after all. It had simply been rebuilt, stronger and truer, out of understanding and respect. He had his eternity, and she had her moments. And in the end, they were both free. She held the letter to her heart, the preserved jasmine resting on the windowsill beside her. She watched the sun sink into the ocean, the colors deepening, then fading into the soft, velvet dark. It was a convenient escape, the end of the day. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen.